There are a few games that have earned the reverence that Mass Effect has. With the Legendary Edition and a brand new game on the horizon, we decided to go back to where it all began and take a look at the history of Mass Effect. If you're a fan, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more Mass Effect videos, because we've got a lot of them on the channel and more are coming. Mass Effect developer BioWare was founded in 1995. The infamous tidbit about its beginnings was that 3 of its co-founders were actually medical doctors who loved gaming, and would create small simulation games on the side. The team cut their teeth on a handful of successful role-playing games, including Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights. But it wasn't until a partnership with LucasArts in the early aughts that they would finally get to work on their opus, Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic, a Star Wars game where you could create your own character, command your own spaceship, explore iconic planets, and assemble your team. Throughout the main quest, players were able to make decisions which affected the ending of their game. It was through this that project director Casey Hudson was able to lay the framework for what the team was calling SFX. In September 2003, Hudson sat down for lunch with the Doctors and didn't just pitch one game, but 3. He envisioned an ambitious trilogy where your character, actions, and choices are carried over from one game to the next. As the story goes, one of the Doctors still remembers burning his tongue on hot soup during Hudson's bold pitch. The ambition didn't end there either. Hudson wanted to make a game that spanned an entire galaxy, with a fast-paced combat system that would rival third-person action games. The game would be developed by the same team that created Knights of the Old Republic. Hudson imagined a game where players could freely explore planets in an online component that, by today's standards, sounds awfully similar to Destiny or The Division. The original pitch document mentions virtual environments where you can meet other players and trade items with them in a dynamic in-game economy. While the online component didn't quite make the cut, the Doctors gave Hudson the green light for the project and pre-production began. The team spent the first year putting the building blocks in place for this massive universe. Hudson and art director Derek Watts wanted to create a vision of the future that was clean and slick, a universe where form was just as important as style. Hudson felt that at the time, most science fiction was dark and gritty, and that Mass Effect could touch on a style of science fiction that hadn't yet been tapped in games. Drawing inspiration from futuristic art of the 70s and 80s and films like Red Planet and Solaris, Project SFX soon became Mass Effect. Most of us loved the sleek environments and the gameplay, but the exploration was a little more divisive. The Maker was your way of exploring the dozens of, well, rather bland and kind of empty optional worlds that Mass Effect had to offer. There was a red planet, a green planet, a blue planet, a white one, and even a couple of other colours. If you were lucky, you'd come across a crate-filled room, but after that, you've seen all the crate-filled rooms. Unfortunately, the technology at the time made it difficult for BioWare to create multiple, truly unique planets, but Casey Hudson and his team did manage to pull off the combat. The original pitch for Commander Shepard had them be similar to a Jack Bauer or James Bond figure, one who would do anything they needed to, and get away with it, to get the job done. To get that feeling across, players were able to combine firearms with biotic powers, tech skills, and squad abilities in order to take down enemies. They could experiment with different weapons, armor, mods, and bullet types to make weapons feel like their own. This feature was actually surprisingly in-depth, but unfortunately a lot of it was buried under clunky and complicated menus in the final game. The combat also evolved quite a bit over the course of development. During one of the early trailers, BioWare showed off a system that, like KOTOR and later Dragon Age, would allow players to swap between squad members in order to carry out different objectives and find enemy weak points. Instead, BioWare settled for a squad command feature that would allow you to use squad mates' abilities on the fly and tell them where to go and what to do. Despite the heavy focus on action-based combat, Mass Effect was still first and foremost an RPG, and had the most in-depth leveling systems of the trilogy. Throughout the game, you were constantly collecting new equipment, weapons, mods, and armor, not just for Commander Shepard, but for your entire team. In conversations, an unobtrusive radial menu would pop up seconds before you would respond. You'd pick a response and Shepard's dialogue would cut in seamlessly. The camera would even shift and react to Shepard's movements depending on how they'd respond in different situations, giving it more of a cinematic feel. And speaking of cinematic, BioWare added a ton of film grain and enough lens flare to make JJ blush. Mass Effect proved to be an excellent introduction into a universe and laid the groundwork for one of the most ambitious gaming trilogies ever created. Players and critics were quick to point out its shortcomings, but the things that worked really well. BioWare had created a huge universe teeming with stories to tell, and the possibilities were endless. In February 2009, BioWare released a cryptic teaser for Mass Effect 2. It listed some of Shepard's achievements from the first game, and it ended with a line of text saying that he or she was killed in action. The ruse didn't last all that long, as at E3 in June of that year, BioWare showed off that yes, Shepard was still alive in their ambitious sequel. And I don't use the word ambitious lightly. Throughout Mass Effect, you made many decisions, some that impacted who lived or died in that game, and others whose ramifications weren't yet known. Characters that had died for some players were entirely written out in 2, and the decisions you made in the first game had rippling effects on the state of the galaxy. Mass Effect 2 truly felt like an experience that had been molded by the player, but it's hard to talk about the sequel without acknowledging its change in direction. Exploration was toned down, as was the deep weapon and power customization. Players could pick and choose which assignments they'd tackle, but the levels themselves were fairly linear. The Mako was cut altogether, with a floating vehicle called the Hammerhead being added in a later DLC mission. Mass Effect 2 was a much more focused and refined version of a series players were quickly falling in love with. With 12 squad mates after DLC, there was no shortage of personality aboard the Normandy. Mordin was a cold but eccentric Solarian scientist, Thane a Drell assassin coming to terms with his own impending death, and Grunt a Krogan bred for war. Now those were just a few of them. Each character had a fleshed out backstory and loyalty missions to strengthen your bond with them. These missions were optional, but I'd go as far as to say that BioWare told some of its finest stories through these side quests.
No. You always had a plan. Masked life signs or an onboard medical stasis program maybe. You wouldn't. They're wrong. You wouldn't just die like this.
One of the most startling things about Mass Effect 2 was just how much darker its tone was than its predecessors. Human colonies were being abducted by the thousands. New squad mates like Jack and Thane were cold-blooded killers, and Shepard had defected to a human extremist group called Cerberus. The dominating blue hues were replaced with reds and oranges, and you would spend the game building up to this epic conclusion, the infamous suicide mission.
There it is, the Collector base.
Mass Effect 2 was an enormous success, a critical darling, and recipient of numerous awards, including the BAFTA for Best Game. It quickly earned spots on lists of best games of all time, and fans absolutely adored it. The pressure for the third part of the trilogy was immense. Could Mass Effect 3 marry the two very different tones of ME1 and 2 together, as well as make good on the countless decisions players had made along the way to create a conclusion and sequel befitting of both? The answer to that is, in some cases, yes, but in other cases, no. Mass Effect 3 was still very much an action game, but it did mark the return for some of the series' early RPG elements. The leveling system was much more in-depth than 2's, and weapon and character customization were taken to further lengths. It was still a little light on exploration, but with the impending threat of the Reapers coming to destroy the galaxy, would there really be that much time for exploring? Probably not. So instead, BioWare took another crack at the combat and managed to squeeze in the last puzzle piece that was always missing: melee attacks. For the first time in this series, combat just kind of came together and worked beautifully. It didn't feel janky like Mass Effect 1 and felt more cohesive than Mass Effect 2. It emphasized combos, let you grab enemies from behind cover, and added new powers. The place it really shone was in the game's PvE multiplayer mode, which is still actually active today. The combat was the best it had ever been, and narratively all the dominoes that had been set up over the course of 6 years were finally starting to fall. Decisions came full circle, like the Rachni Queen on Noveria and Captain Kirahi's fate on Virmire. Players had vastly different experiences with Mass Effect 3, all based on big and little decisions they had made in 1 and 2. Throughout the game, it provided payoff after payoff and huge emotional beats. That is, until it didn't. To say expectations for Mass Effect 3's ending were high is an understatement, but the endings players got weren't quite what fans were hoping for. All your decisions over the course of 3 games boiled down to 3 endings: blue, red, green. Control, destroy, synthesis, respectively. Players were quick to point out numerous plot holes and that a lot of your decisions ended up feeling inconsequential. This didn't sit well with fans, and they were vocal. It didn't stop with the YouTube comments and threatening tweets seen within the first few days of Mass Effect 3's release either. A petition popped up online demanding BioWare fix the ending. Sadly, developers were even getting death threats. The team was crushed after 10 years of development. Fans swore off the series altogether just because of the last 2 hours. But it didn't take too long for BioWare to spring into action to set things straight. A few months after release, BioWare gave fans an extended cut of the ending that covered up some plot holes, added an extra ending, and added a little bit more meat to the original 3. However, just talking about how the game ended doesn't do Mass Effect 3 justice. The ending may not have taken into account your previous choices, but the entire game did. Missions would vary depending on how you chose to play, either Paragon or Renegade, characters will be absent in some playthroughs, and relationships were dramatically different. And now that the wounds about the ending have mostly healed, it's easy to see how impressive the Mass Effect trilogy is. Hudson and BioWare's high ambitions were met, and after the beloved Citadel DLC, the studio took a well-deserved break from the franchise. At E3 2014, BioWare teased another Mass Effect game before fully revealing it the following year. The initial trailer was short on details, other than it would be taking players to a new galaxy and that there'd be jetpacks. I remember everyone being very excited about the jetpacks. Mass Effect Andromeda marked a huge departure from the original trilogy in a number of ways, not just because it took place in a new galaxy. It was made by a new team in Montreal rather than Edmonton. It used a new engine, EA's Frostbite, which was a struggle for the team to get to grips with. Mass Effect's infamous Paragon and Renegade morality system was removed completely, and there was much more of an emphasis on exploration than ever before. And of course, there was no Shepard. In Andromeda, you'd play as one of the Ryder twins, a pathfinder who was responsible for finding golden worlds for Milky Way civilizations to settle in the Andromeda galaxy. Add a new ship, the Tempest, a new vehicle, new squad mates, powers, enemies, and it all amounted to a huge change, and the reception was mixed. Development was turbulent, to say the least. According to a report from Jason Schreier, early production had the game down as more of a No Man's Sky type adventure, with the Pathfinder and their crew landing on potentially infinite procedurally generated worlds. The team couldn't figure out how to implement a BioWare caliber story in a game with so many shifting parts, so it was canned. A new engine brought about its own issues, and Frostbite was actually lacking a lot of key features that BioWare needed to create RPGs. BioWare had managed to get it to work for Dragon Age Inquisition, but they had a hell of a time doing it. According to Schreier's article, BioWare developers said that at that time, an animation system was a key thing that Frostbite didn't have, which is why Andromeda's animation was a little strange.
To whom? And your goddamn father. Sorry, my face is tired from dealing with everything.
But Andromeda's combat was where it shone. It was more similar to Mass Effect 3's multiplayer, and while it pared back issuing commands to your squad mates, it was frenetic, with Ryder constantly dashing and leaping around the battlefield instead of cowering behind waist-high crates. No shade to Commander Shepard there. It was way heavier on RPG elements, and the exploration was way more interesting than Mass Effect 1's. The Nomad vehicle was a blast to drive, partly because the Need for Speed team assisted in developing it. Andromeda's reception was lukewarm though. Players didn't connect with Ryder's story or squad mates with the same intensity as they did with Shepard. Its sales weren't particularly strong either. BioWare quickly began to address feedback and fix the game's numerous bugs and animation glitches, but the single-player DLC for the game ended up being cancelled. People were definitely soured on Mass Effect at that point, but luckily the series wasn't going to end on that disappointing feeling. On N7 Day 2020, the Mass Effect Legendary Edition was officially revealed, a 4K remaster of the original trilogy complete with all DLC, except for Pinnacle Station, which was sadly corrupted, and a modernized control scheme. And then, a few weeks later at the Game Awards, the future of the franchise was revealed, the next Mass Effect. Its trailer featured nods to both Andromeda and the original trilogy. It showed 2 galaxies, the Milky Way and Andromeda, a dead Reaper, and a look at fan-favourite Liara, who was uncovering some N7 armour. Right now, the theories believe that it will somehow be a sequel to both the original trilogy and Andromeda. Mass Effect is an important franchise to so many, and while it's had its ups and downs, you can't deny just how high those highs got. The Suicide Mission, its incredible DLCs in the form of Citadel and Lair of the Shadow Broker, and dozens of hours spent with characters who feel like friends is something that most fans will never forget. Its lows have been disappointing, but I'm so relieved that the series will continue in some form while celebrating and remastering its past for new fans to enjoy. And I don't know about you, but it just feels really great to be excited about Mass Effect again.